To commemorate the patrol's 50th anniversary in 1981, Sergeant Charles E. Walker created a book entitled Trooper. It was a compilation of 10 interviews with patrol retirees. All these years later, these interviews still give a glimpse into those early years of the agency. With a career that spanned 4 decades and part of a fifth, Tillie Sonnen, in 1981, had the distinction of being the longest working Highway Patrol employee with 40 years of service. She was there at the patrol's modest beginning and witnessed the growth of the department to a force of over 700 officers. Always a dedicated employee, Tillie exhibits a ready humor, a zest for life, undiminished by the passage of time. What follows is the reading of that interview. If they like you, they'll hire you permanently. If they don't, you're gone. No questions asked. That was what I was told before taking temporary employment at the Missouri Highway Department headquarters here in Jefferson City. It was February 1931, and I was glad to find a job, even if it was only for a few weeks, because the hatchery where I had worked for 7.5 years had closed, leaving me unemployed. I started in the secretarial pool, working beside my roommate, Hilda Hutchinson, who still lives with me today. When one of the divisions needed a typist, they'd call down and we'd work for one fellow until a particular project was completed, then be assigned to someone else. Hilda had started working there in the September of 1930 and was soon assigned a permanent job in one of the divisions, but I remained in the pool. Though I didn't know at the time, this was the best place I could have been, for it led directly to my career with the patrol. Governor Caulfield signed the bill creating the Highway Patrol on April 24th, and soon thereafter named his secretary, Lewis Ellis of Bethany, as the first superintendent. The bill became effective on September 14, so there was a great deal of work to be done in a short time. Applications had to be printed, sent out, and screened when they came back. Applicants had to be tested, and the very structure of the patrol had to be planned, all in the space of a few months. One day in July, Mo Dribbin, the personnel manager for the Highway Department, 2 other secretaries, and I, principally because I had no permanent assignment, were sent over to the governor's office to help process letters from prospective applicants for the patrol. We found a filing cabinet filled with over 5,000 letters requesting applications. They were in no particular order, just pitched in there as they arrived in the mail. The 4 of us sorted them by county, weeded out those who were too young, too old, ineligible for some other reason, and sent out applications. In the meantime, the 2 secretaries returned to the Highway Department, leaving Mo and I to study the applications when they arrived. After screening out more men who didn't qualify, we set up an examination schedule according to senatorial districts and notified candidates when to appear for their tests. While we handled the applications, Superintendent Ellis, his assistant, Major Lewis Means, actually a captain, but called Major from his military rank, and the legal counsel of the Highway Department, Marvin Krause, toured several states, investigating their state police organizations for ideas on how to organize the Missouri Patrol and to look at their uniforms, cars, and other equipment. Our organization was patterned mostly after the New Jersey State Police, but they also visited Pennsylvania, New York, and Michigan. Although the Patrol Act called for a force of 125 officers, lowered appropriations reduced the number to 55, of which 6 were captains and 49 were troopers. Besides Means, 2 other men were named captains before recruit training began, Louis Eslick and Albert Shepard, both of whom helped in the selection process. The other 3 were named later, Thomas Lee, when he began training, William Baxter, and Schuyler French at the end of training. During the English examination for the patrol candidates, I remember checking one fellow's that read, "I arrived at the accident scene at 10 p.m. I showed it to Shepard. Reads okay to me, Tillie," he chuckled. He wrote it like it had sounded. From July to September, we worked from 8 a.m. until 6 or 7 p.m. There was so much to do, and we were anxious to have everything ready by the 14th. One of the girls working with us complained. "I've had it," she said. "I was hired to work 8 to 5, and I'm not going to work any more long hours." Well, I thought, you haven't been out of work for a while like I have. Heck, I was just glad to have a job. September passed, then October, and Mo Dribbin and I were still temporarily assigned to the patrol. "You can stay on here, I'll bet," said Dribbin. "They'll need a secretary, and you've been with them from the first. I'll be going back before long, but something tells me they'll keep you if you want to stay." But as November began and the graduation date for the first class of recruits approached, I hadn't heard anything definite. Colonel Ellis invited me to ride with him to the graduation ceremonies in St. Louis. On the way down there, he said, "Miss Sonnen, I don't know whether anyone has told you or not, but I've asked that you be transferred to the patrol permanently. I hope you like it." Like it? Why, I was thrilled to death. It was a new organization, the first statewide police organization in the history of the state. I can't describe how exciting it was to be there at the beginning, just being part of it, seeing it grow and develop, meeting and working with the officers, sharing their experiences. General Headquarters and Headquarters Troop, now Troop F, occupied 2 rooms in the Capitol building when we started. I worked for both the troop and GHQ. Colonel Ellis's secretary, Rose Bender, and I were the only stenographers, but we were all they needed because Headquarters Troop consisted of just 8 officers. Major Means, Sergeants Lewis, Howard, and Ben Booth. 7 sergeants had been named statewide in addition to the 6 captains, and troopers Harry Hansen, Ray Cushman, Jim McCann, Paul Burge, and Gilbert Fowler. I'll never forget the morning the first reports arrived from the field. As stenographer, I was supposed to type up the summaries, but Sergeant Howard was so excited and curious that he grabbed the reports and typed them himself. I kidded him about that later on. "Boy, you're not as anxious to total up these reports as you were the first day," I said. You can understand our enthusiasm, though. We had no idea what the reports would be like, what adventures the officers would encounter. Some of them were funny. I still have a service rendered slip dated February 20th, 1932, and signed by Means and Howard that reads, quote, "Removed very dangerous piece of auto casing from the road. Then slowed down to avoid hitting hens. Very valuable service. No dead cats in sight, and couldn't find any to kill and place on the highway to remove." End quote. They were only partially kidding about the cats. Some of the men sharpened their shooting eyes by controlling the stray cat population in rural areas. My salary with the patrol was $115 a month, which was almost as much as the officers earned, at $125 a month. When the men received their first raise, I typed the letters notifying them. Without thinking, I blurted out, "Well, gosh, what do us secretaries get out of it?" The next morning, Rose and I found 2-pound boxes of candy on our desks with notes from Colonel Ellis, "For good work, well done." He'd overheard me. Lewis Ellis was a fine choice for the first superintendent. He was intelligent, a good speaker, and writer. He had a newspaper background. Even-tempered, firm but fair, a friendly person and easy to work for. He was young, about 32 at the time of his appointment, but a very able superintendent. When this ticket-fixing scandal in Troop C hit the news recently, people said, "My, what a shame, something like this has never happened before to the Highway Patrol." But it has. Only 6 months after the organization was formed, the first officer was terminated, not for ticket-fixing, but for taking a bribe. The officer later wrote a letter apologizing for betraying the trust it placed in him, but the termination stood. This first incident happened in February of 1932, and it wasn't long before another officer was accused of misconduct, drinking in uniform. The patrol held a hearing, found him guilty, and fired him too. These events were the exception, never the rule. Most of the officers were honest, hard-working, and dedicated to their jobs. There's no question in my mind that the efficiency, dependability, and helpfulness demonstrated by the first troopers saved the patrol, for there were those who would have abolished it. The bill creating the organization was defeated several times before passage in 1931, and other pieces of legislation were introduced in following years to disband the patrol. Colonel Ellis emphasized that officers were to help people whenever they could, and by following his philosophy they won the respect and friendship of thousands of Missouri citizens. Speaking of hard work, I received a letter from Ray Cushman recently in which he mentioned that at the beginning they rarely took a leave day. They were afraid to, because in those depression-ridden years, thousands were lined up for their jobs. When the first class graduated, each man was given a choice of driving a car or a motorcycle, and Cushman chose a cycle. "Cush," I asked him one time, "why did you choose the motorcycle?" "Tillie," he replied, remembering cold rides and countless spills, "I'll be darned if I know." Cushman and Jim McCann were the only single troopers in the area, and they cut quite a swath through the single girls around Jefferson City. A few days before Christmas, 1932, they came into the office with 6 or 8 boxes of candy. "Tillie, would you help wrap these for us?" they said. I loved to wrap packages, and when I finished, they asked which one's the prettiest. I examined them, and I picked one. "That's for you," they said. They took the others, tagged them "Merry Christmas" from Cush and McCann, and gave them to their girlfriends, most of whom they've both dated. Can you imagine 2 guys giving joint gifts to the same girls? Well, that's what they did. McCann later confined his affection to 2 girls, one from Jefferson City and the other from Hannibal. "Tillie, I got a tough tough job to do," he said one morning. "What's that?" "I've got to tell this gal here in Jeff that I'm going to marry the one in Hannibal. This is sure going to be rough." I don't know who it was roughest on, the girl or McCann, but he did wind up marrying the one from Hannibal. Lewis Ellis was the superintendent until May 1933, when newly elected Governor Guy Park replaced him with B. Marvin Castile. Castile was a good superintendent, but I always thought it was too bad Ellis served so short a time. He was a great planner, and I'm sure he had dreams of making the patrol even better, but it wasn't to be. With the administration changing, all of us civilians expected to be terminated, as was the custom then. The first to go was the janitor. "We're next," promised Rose Bender. It was terrible sitting there at your desk wondering when they'd call you in and tell you that your services were no longer needed. In early June, Rose was replaced by a girl sent in by the governor's office. It was only a matter of time, I told myself. On Monday morning, the 12th of June, Colonel Castile walked into the office with a lady wearing a gray suit and cape. She was short and very attractive. My replacement, no doubt. Castile and the girl went into his office. A few minutes later, the buzzer sounded. "Tillie, you're gone," it seemed to say. But he didn't want me. He wanted his new secretary, Mrs. Watts. I sat there on the edge of my seat until the three of them came out a few minutes later. "Miss Sonnen," said Castile, "I'd like you to meet my wife," indicating the girl in gray. Was I surprised? When the colonel and his wife had gone, I confided to the secretary that I thought Mrs. Castile was there to take my job. When she stopped laughing, she said, "I've got to tell the colonel about that. Do you mind?" "No, of course not," I said. Mrs. Castile laughed about it the next day. "Boy, I didn't think it showed that I wanted a job that bad," she said. They had 5 children, and the colonel's salary barely enabled them to live comfortably. On Wednesday the 14th, Sergeant Ben Booth and Sheriff Roger Wilson of Boone County were shot and killed at a roadblock north of Columbia. Booth was the first Missouri trooper to lose his life in the performance of his duty. Colonel Castile was forced to remain in the troop headquarters most of the day to coordinate the manhunt, but everyone else was out searching for the killers. 5 o'clock came, and Mrs. Watts went home, but I stayed to help any way I could. I guess I didn't go home until after 11 o'clock that night, and I was back at my desk early the following morning. The search continued for 2 years, finally resulting in the capture of George McKeever, who killed Booth, and Francis McNeely, who shot Sheriff Wilson. A few days after the murder of Booth and Wilson, Colonel Castile called me into his office. "Miss Sonnen, I don't want you to worry any more about your job. You'll stay as long as I will." Boy, that made me feel good. Then a few months later, I had cause for doubt. Talk was that a girl had been selected to replace me by the governor's office. Ha, I thought, that reassurance I got a while back was just a politician talking. One morning a call came to our office for the other girl. I told them, "Sorry, she doesn't work here." "But she soon will, and Tillie won't," I added under my breath. I had misjudged Castile, for he went to bat for me, telling them I'd been there at the beginning, knew the job, and that if discharged, I'd just go back to the highway department. For once the administration gave in and let me stay. It's hard to believe, but General Headquarters moved 11 times before finally being housed in a highway patrol building. When the legislature convened in 1933, we moved from the Capitol building to the top floor of a big house near Madison Street and Capitol Avenue, where the municipal garage is today. At the conclusion of the legislative session, it was back to the Capitol. In 1935, we were in the church building across the street from the house, and in 1937, we were quartered in the building next to the Missouri Hotel on High Street. Trooper J.D. Ellis worked in the fingerprint section next door to the typist room in the Capitol. One day I was typing along, and I heard a pop from the direction of Ellis's office. I didn't think too much about it, thinking he might have dropped something, or that it might have been a car backfiring outside. Suddenly the door burst open, and Ellis came running in with a dazed expression on his face. "What's the matter, Ellis?" I said. I pulled the trigger," he stammered. We investigated and found that he had fired a round into the wall between the offices while cleaning his pistol. Somebody pasted a bullseye target over the hole, and it hung there for years afterward, above the filing cabinets. Ellis entered the service in World War II and died in a concentration camp in Japan. He was a nice fellow, but probably never would have been hired today because he walked with a slight limp. During the war, several men were hired with partial disabilities. In 1939, we left the Capitol forever and were given the ground floor of the Broadway State Office Building, which we shared with other state departments. In later years, we occupied larger sections of the building as we gained employees. 11 moves of desks, chairs, files, and supplies. No telling how many pairs of scissors we lost. Captain Bob Moore expressed his disapproval of our quarters in the Broadway building to the Colonel Castile, saying, "We needed more room." "Oh, forget it," said the colonel. "We can get along fine now. By the time we need more space, we'll have our own building." Little did he realize that it would be 1963 before his prediction came true, 24 years later. Inmates of the penitentiary always did the moving. At the Broadway building, one of them wasn't working fast enough to suit Captain Moore. "You there! "Hurry up and get going and move that furniture," he ordered. The inmate eyed him and said, "Listen, mister, I've got 99 years to do this, and I'm in no hurry to get finished." One of the most impressive officers on the force in the 30s and early 40s was Bob Moore, who joined the patrol in 1931 and left in 1946. His memory was phenomenal. He'd read a book and recite passages verbatim. Moore started the Identification Bureau and also organized and commanded the Safety Squadron, a group of officers who traveled the state on motorcycles, promoting safety through concentrated efforts of enforcement and public programs. In fact, Moore originated a lot more ideas than he ever received credit for. He'd drop a suggestion on his supervisors, and before long, there'd be an order stating a new program or procedure. Moore didn't care, as long as things got done. We only had one bathroom in that old house in Madison and Capitol, and a bothersome situation at times, especially when someone would go in, sit down, and start reading a book. Bob Moore was one of the worst offenders. People would be lined up outside while Moore read inside, and finally somebody would holler, "Hey, Moore, you wanted on the telephone." It was the only way to get him out. About 1933 we were giving examinations to patrol applicants when I got into the middle of a feud between two captains. Each was conducting a different test. The first one handed me about 100 physical exams, saying, "Here, you hold on to these for me. I've got to leave for a while, but I'd like to go over them again when I return." As soon as the first captain was gone, the second walked over to my desk. "Those papers belong to me. Give them here," he ordered. Here was one guy trying to spite the other and me in between. "Okay," I said, "take your darned old papers." Bob Moore saw the whole thing and thought it was funny. "Don't get hot, Tillie," he said. "Don't get hot." A few minutes later the first captain came back in the room. "I'd like to have those exams, please," he said. "I haven't got them," I said. He knew exactly where they were and left to hash it out with the other fellow. After I cooled down I began thinking that if word of how I'd talked to that officer reached Castile he might not approve. I was starting to worry when Major Means came up and said, "Colonel Castile wants to see you." My heart skipped a beat. Did you tell him what happened?" I asked. "Yeah." I was shaken as I approached the colonel's office. I just knew he was going to say, "Listen, if you're going to talk to a captain like you just did, we can't have you around." When I walked in, Castile said, "Miss Sonnen, what's your salary?" Oh no, I'm getting a pay cut, I thought. $115 a month, I managed to say. "Okay, beginning the first of the month, it'll be $125, he said. I was flabbergasted. I don't remember thanking him or saying anything. I just turned around and walked out fast before he changed his mind. The World's Fair was held in Chicago in 1933, and several of our men served on a detail there. I went up and enjoyed the sights. I came back with Trooper Harry Hansen, his wife Martha, and Trooper Charlie Newman, who was driving. Harry sat in the front with Charlie, and Martha and I were in the back. That was a wild ride, let me tell you. Newman was taking the curve so fast that steamer trunk stacked in the seat slid over and mashed us. Then he'd swing into a curve the other way, and the trunks would slide back off us. We were screaming around a turn somewhere in Illinois when we began going in circles. When we stopped, we were heading back toward Chicago. Poor Martha began crying, begging Charlie to slow down, but he never did. We left Chicago at 11:30 p.m., pulled into Jefferson City at 7:45 a.m. the next morning, with many coffee stops en route. Not a fast trip by today's standards, but in 1933 roads weren't so good. What an experience. Major Lewis Means was known for being close with his money. But there was one officer who was considered even tighter, Melvin Dace of Troop E. The fellows used to tell about Dace going into a restaurant in Chicago during the World's Fair and ordering pie and coffee. "Would you like cream on your pie?" asked the waitress. "Does it cost any more?" said Dace. "If it does, I don't want it." In 1939 Colonel Castile left the patrol for a job with the WPA. Mrs. Watts, his secretary, went with him, and I became secretary for the acting superintendent, A.D. Shepard. Following Shepard came Ramsey, Ginn, Wallace, Wagner, Harrison, Wagner again, and Hockaday. Except for the last two superintendents, Sam Smith and Al Lupker, I've worked for every one the patrol has ever had. I came close to quitting under M. Stanley Ginn, who served from 1941 to 1944. I got a call one weekend from the office to come over and take dictation. This wasn't unusual, as I'd sometimes come in on Saturday or Sunday when a big investigation was underway. I started over to my desk to pick up my notebook and pencils when one of the sergeants said, "Tillie, your desk was moved." "It was?" I said in surprise. "Yeah, they moved it out to the front office. A new girl's been hired as the superintendent's secretary." It was all right with me if he wanted to hire someone new. She was a cute little thing. But at least he could have said something before he moved me from one office to another. "Okay," I said. I was burning. I went in and told Ginn, "I've never felt any more like quitting than I do right now." Mike Hockaday, then a sergeant, said, "Now, Tillie, don't quit. Just sit tight and let things ride." I was still mad, though. If I hadn't been taking care of my mother at the time, I'd have told Ginn what he could have done with that job, but I stuck around. As things turned out, it was for the right decision. The new girl resigned very soon thereafterward. Then they brought in another one who couldn't spell, and I wound up doing all her work. When she took dictation, I'd have to sit in to make sure nothing was left out. Ginn finally left for the service in 1944. Ginn got off on the wrong foot with me from the beginning. After his appointment to superintendent in November of 1941, he brought me a stack of letters of congratulation, over 400 of them, from friends and well-wishers. "Here, answer these," he said. "You'll have to pick out my fishing buddies and attorney friends. They get special letters." Well, I didn't know him or them, and I was overwhelmed at the task before me. Most of the letters made no direct reference to the writer's occupation or relationship to Ginn, so how was I to proceed? I wound up reading all of them and guessing by what was said in the letter to which category the person belonged, social, business, and so on. That was a job. When Trooper Hugh Wagner was appointed superintendent in 1945, you might say it was a surprise to most of us. Why, I'd hardly heard of him. He wasn't the sort of fellow that attracted attention. Wagner's first question when he moved into his new office was, "How do I answer the telephone?" He didn't know whether to say General Headquarters, Highway Patrol, Hello, or what. His first term as superintendent was largely a learning experience. Luckily, K.K. Johnson and Mike Hockaday had been there for years and knew the ins and outs of running the organization. When Wagner returned for his second hitch as patrol head, though, he'd gotten it together. His interim job with the National Safety Council had taught him a lot about administration, I guess. I was Colonel Mike Hockaday's secretary for 6 years following Hugh Wagner's death in 1965. Colonel Hockaday is retired now, too, but he is still active in community affairs, the Salvation Army, State Retirees Association, Memorial Hospital Auxiliary. He just can't say no. My first memory of Colonel Hockaday is of him coming into GHQ to talk to J.D. Ellis and learn how to read fingerprints. It was 1937, and he was a patrol applicant. We were always interested in the fellows who were applying. "You just wait," one of the officers said. "That Hockaday fellow will be in before long." I can still see him wearing a white, stiff-brim hat, smiling at everyone. I've been secretary of the Patrol's Retiree Association since 1972. It's not terribly difficult, but it does involve some time. I told them recently I thought someone else should have a chance at the job. When retired Lieutenant Fenimore, the chairman of the nominating committee, heard that, he said, "Oh, hell, she can't quit." The job has kept me in touch with people, and this is important. I don't know how anybody could work for an organization most of his adult life, then just walk out the door and forget about it. Looking back to 1931, I remember how close everyone on the patrol was, like a family. Of course, there were fewer of us in the organization, and the organization had to grow to keep pace with the times. But when it grew larger, some of the closeness was lost. It was inevitable, I suppose. I visit GHQ often, and everyone is so wonderful to me. I know some must wonder, what's that old woman doing out here? But I still feel that I'm a part of the patrol, and I always will be. I'm just grateful for the opportunities I've had to know such fine people. The interview you just heard took place in 1980. Miss Tillie Sonnen died July 7, 1996.